Chapter 3. The Antiquity of the Evangelical Churches in the Valleys of Piemont, from the days of Christ and his Apostles, down to the present age. The foregoing chapter presents to the reader's eye the beautiful situation of the valleys of Piemont, with the great abundance of fruits, which the earth there brings forth, both for the necessity and convenience of the body. This gives him as pleasant a prospect of the heavenly situation of those evangelical churches, together with the spiritual and divine fruits of faith, hope, and patience, which were long since planted by Christ and his apostles, and cultivated by their successors in following generations, down to this present age. True it is that a great part of the most ancient records and authentic pieces, treating of and discovering the antiquity of those churches, have been industriously sought after and committed to the flames by their bloody persecutors in the years 1559 and 1560, that so the truth of their affairs might lie forever smothered under those ashes and be buried in perpetual silence. Nevertheless, God has been so gracious to his church, both in preserving, as it were by miracle, many authentic pieces relating to this particular, compiled and written by the ancient inhabitants in their own proper language, as also by suffering even the most eminent and bitter of their adversaries, ever and anon unwarily to let fall many remarkable passages to this purpose, in those very writings which they composed expressly against them, that by the help of these two mediums it will be easy to produce such arguments for the antiquity of that religion, which both they and we at this day profess, as are sufficient to convince any sober person, who does not wilfully shut his eyes against a noonday truth. But before we fall directly upon this point, it will be necessary to premise this, namely, that it is a truth generally received by all those who profess to be versed in ecclesiastical history, that before the year 800, the differences between the Catholic and Reformed churches, excepting some few clouds of ceremonies, which were yet no bigger than a man's hand, did not at all publicly appear, at least so as to be established by general councils or decrees, in any part of Italy. As for the first 500 years, Bishop Jewell will undertake that not any one clear sentence can be produced out of any one father or council for the Papists against the Protestants, and therefore we may take the generality of the fathers and writers in those ages to be on our side, in all points then controverted and now maintained by us against Rome, so that the main of the queer will fall upon the two next centuries, which was a period most barren of authors, and of those few that wrote, Italy had but a small proportion. Yet we may instance in one or two of note. Gregory I, entitled the Great, who died AD 605, besides his detesting and rejecting the title of ecumenical bishop, which was the next year after his death, claimed by Boniface III, consented to by Phocas the Emperor, and confirmed by a council at Rome, AD 607, is ours in very many points against the present Church of Rome, some whereof Illicrus in his Catalogue Testium hath collected, and more might be gathered, had not the Papists so abominably corrupted him, as Dr. Thomas James in his Bellum Gregorianum hath made to appear in some hundreds of places. Also, Paulinus, Bishop of Aquileia, in the year 790, held the truth in many of the controverted points, as appears out of the same Elicris. In the year 794, the Synod of Frankfurt, at which were present many Italian bishops, condemned the Second Nicene Council for decreeing image worship, though Binius and others would fain evade it. For confirmation whereof there are cited Aventinus L4, Aemonius L4, c. 85, Hincmarus in Lugd, Episcope chapter 20, Ab Urpergenis, whose testimonies are related by Hospinian, De Origin Imaginum, chapter 10, printed Tiguri 1603, and partly by Vignier in his Recueil de l'Histoire de l'Église, 80 on 794. These things being premised, in the first place, therefore, it may be affirmed that these churches of the valleys of Piemont remained united with the other Christian churches, and particularly with that of Rome, so long as it retained the true religion, which was planted throughout all Italy by the apostles, their disciples, and successors. But whenas the Church of Rome began to corrupt itself, and would by no means be persuaded to retain the purity of that apostolical doctrine and divine worship, then those of the valleys began to separate themselves from them, and to come out from amongst them, that so they might not be partakers of their sins, nor receive of their plagues. And this is evident by diverse very ancient manuscripts, long since laid up and preserved in the valley of Pragela, which do directly strike at and oppose the errors of the Church of Rome. Among these manuscripts there are three very considerable. The first is entitled Qual cosa sia Antichrist, that is to say, What thing is Antichrist, which was written in the year 1120. The second was written, as is supposed, much about the same time, entitled Purgatori Soima, that is to say, The Dream of Purgatory. The third is as ancient as the other two, and entitled The Causa del Nostro Departiment de l'Iglesia Romana, that is to say, The Cause of Our Separation from the Church of Rome. These manuscripts are not only made mention of by that famous and learned Mr. Paul Perrin in his History des Vaudois, but likewise averred by Mr. Thomas Tronken, the chief minister of Geneva, a person of known probity and learning, whose formal attestation is here inserted. The attestation of Mr. Thomas Tronken, the chief minister of Geneva, a person of known probity and learning, concerning certain manuscripts touching the ancient doctrine and worship of the evangelical churches in the valleys of Piemont, inserted in Mr. Paul Perrin's History, the true original of which attestation is to be seen, together with the rest of the original papers and pieces of this present history, in the public library of the famous University of Cambridge. I, whose name is here underwritten, minister of the Holy Gospel and divinity professor at Geneva, do attest that Sieur Jean-Paul Perrin, coming into this city to print the history of the Waldenses and Albigenses by him compiled, did then communicate to me that his work and divers original manuscripts, out of which he had extracted the ancient doctrine and discipline of those people, which manuscripts I then saw and perused, in faith whereof I have given this present attestation, to the end that it may serve and bear witness to the truth, when and wherever there shall be occasion. Made at Geneva, November 19th, 1656. Tas Tronkin. Now then, I say, these churches of the valleys of Piemont, separating from the Church of Rome, do not upon this account either begin or cease to be the true Church of God, but rather did hereby manifest their perseverance in that ancient doctrine of Christ and his apostles, from which the Church of Rome was now departed. Even as the Jewish Church of old separated itself from the 10 idolatrous tribes, and so the faithful Jews, believing in Jesus Christ, and retaining the ancient doctrine of the patriarchs and prophets, when they were persecuted by the high priests of the unbelieving Jews, separated themselves from them. But yet neither did the one or the other by this separation lose their ancient right of succession. Nay, on the contrary, they did hereby retain the same in its first channel and primitive purity. In the second place, and in confirmation of the former, the ecclesiastical history that treats of Charles the Great and his followers tells us that both the emperor and the Western churches did jointly strive and use their utmost endeavor in the council held at Frankfurt in the year 794 to have drawn Pope Adrian and the Church of Rome out of that gulf of superstition into which it had precipitated itself by persuading them to embrace the true doctrine of Christ and his apostles. Moreover, that one of the chief counselors of the said emperor, by name Claudius, Archbishop of Turin, and consequently of the valleys of Piemont, was exceeding active, and did very much stickle in this business. This Claudius was one of the most learned and renowned worthies of his age. He was one of the chief founders of the Academy of Paris, as the Bishop de Meaux, in his preface to the books of Charles the Great, touching images, abundantly testifies. And about the year of our Lord 815, the Emperor Louis le Debonair, son of Charles the Great, preferred him to the Archbishopric of Turin, that so he might furnish his diocese with the doctrine devoted, Italica Plebi, to the people of Italy, the which he in truth did with all his might, as his famous adversary Jonas Aurelianus confesseth, as well by frequent writings as by painful and constant preaching to and instructing the flock committed to his charge. For indeed, this holy man, finding that he was not able to withstand that mighty torrent of the Romish superstitions in other parts, employed all his endeavors to preserve his own diocese from being infected with those idolatrous principles. And to this end he ceased not to instruct his people by all ways and means, that they ought not to run to Rome for the pardon of their sins, nor have recourse to the saints or their relics, that the Church is not founded upon St. Peter, much less upon the Pope, but upon the doctrine of the apostles, that they ought not to worship images, nor so much as have them in their churches. And this he observed throughout his whole diocese, as is confessed by the above said Jonas Aurelianus in a book that he wrote expressly against him in the year 820. The same is likewise reported by Bellarmine, from whence I conclude, and it is exceeding remarkable as to the proof of the matter in hand, that the same belief which was publicly taught and professed in those valleys of Piemont in the year 820 was the very same that is at this day professed and owned by the Reformed churches, that is to say, the true, ancient, and evangelical doctrine. To this I shall add that not the most bitter adversaries of this Claudius, Archbishop of Turin, were ever able to lay to his charge any fundamental error, forasmuch as he always retained Fidei Catholica Regulum, the rule of the Catholic faith, and did not express any opposition, save only against the pretended traditions ecclesiastic traditions. These are Jonas Aurelianus' his own expressions, yet in the meantime he dexterously gives himself the lie for that calumny of Arianism, wherewith in other parts of his writings he had unjustly branded that worthy bishop and his disciples, merely for their not complying with the idolatrous and superstitious inventions of the Church of Rome. And this is all likewise that Renarius Sacon has to object against the Waldenses, who succeeded this archbishop and his disciples. For, saith he, all other sects render themselves horrible by reason of their blasphemies against God himself. But on the contrary, this hath great appearance of piety, forasmuch as they live justly in the sight of men. They believe well, as concerning God, in all things, and hold all the articles of the creed. There is only one thing against them, that is, they hate and blaspheme the Church of Rome, and hereby they easily gain credit and belief among the people. In like manner, Samuel de Cassina, a friar of the Franciscan order, writing against the Waldenses, inhabiting the valleys of Piemont, declares plainly in the beginning of his book, entitled Vittoria Triumphale, printed at Conicum Privilegio in the year 1510, that all the pretended errors of those Waldenses consisted in this, that they denied the Church of Rome to be the Holy Mother Church, and would not obey her traditions. As touching other points, he confesseth that the Waldenses did acknowledge the Christian Church, whereof likewise he reckons and esteems them as true members. By this then, they say, first, it plainly appears that the inhabitants of those valleys have professed and taught the same evangelical doctrine which they now own, before the Dukes of Savoy had any possession of Piemont. And therefore he has no justifiable pretext to deprive them of their ancient liberties and privileges upon the account of religion. Again, it is as manifest and necessarily follows that the Waldenses who escaped the massacres in France in the year 1165 and came from thence into the valleys of Piemont were not the first founders of that religion, but rather that they joined themselves to those their faithful brethren for the better fortifying and mutual edification of each other's faith, just as those other Waldenses did, who, having recourse to Bohemia, closed with the faithful professors of the Greek Church there, who had retained the ancient and true religion, not the papal, as Stranchi Rape Bohem testifies. Neither is it at all probable that it could be otherwise, for the Waldenses knew right well that the seat of their chief adversary was in Italy, and therefore they would not have been so void of all sense and common prudence as to have undertaken so long and tedious a journey over the Alps, had they not been well assured that the natives of those valleys, who professed the same religion with them, would receive and embrace them as their brethren. Daubigny, a very judicious historian, seems to be clearly of this opinion, and Mr. Perrin, amongst his other manuscripts, makes mention of a certain epistle of the Waldenses, inscribed I won't read that bit, but that is to say, an epistle to the most serene King Lancelot, the dukes, barons, and most ancient nobility of the realm. The little troop of Christians falsely called by the name of poor people of Lyons, or Waldenses, by which it is most evident that they had not their original from the said Waldo, but that this was a mere nickname, or reproachful term put upon them by their adversaries, to make the world believe that their religion was but a novelty, or a thing of yesterday. Thus those who escaped the massacres in France were by the popish party, surnamed either according to the places where they inhabited, or the chief of their leaders. For example, from Waldo, a citizen of Lyons, they were named Waldenses, and from the country of Albi, Albigenses. And because those who did adhere to the doctrine of Waldo came out of Lyons, naked and stripped of all their goods and estates, they were in derision styled the poor of Lyons. In Dauphine, they were nicknamed in mockery Chaigneros, or Chaignards, and for as much as part of them went over the Alps, they were called Tramontani. In England, they were known by the name of Lollards, from one Lollard who was one of their chief instructors in that isle. In Provence, they were usually termed Sicars, from a vulgar word then in use, which signified cut purses. In Italy, they had been given them the title of Fraticelli, or men of the brotherhood, because they lived together like brethren. In Germany, they were named Gazaris, a word which signifies execrable and wicked in the highest degree. In Flanders, they went under the name of Tourlipins, that is to say, men inhabiting with or companions of wolves, because those poor people were ofttimes constrained in the heat of persecution to inhabit in woods and deserts amongst wild and savage beasts, sometimes to render them more execrable. Their adversaries borrowed the names of several ancient heretics to brand them with. Thus, for as much as they made profession of purity in their life and doctrine, they were called Cataris, that is, Puritans. And because they denied the host, which the priest holds up at Mass, to be God, they were called Arians, as those who denied the divinity of the eternal Son of God. And because they maintained that the authority of the kings and emperors of the world did not depend upon the jurisdiction of the Pope, they were called Manichae, as men asserting two first principles. And for such like causes as these, they were surnamed Gnostics, Cataphrygians, Adamites, and Apostolics. Yea, sometimes their adversaries were outrageous. Matthew Paris calls them ribots, that is, rogues, rascals, scoundrels, varlets, or base fellows. The author of the Tresor de Histoire calls them bougres, that is, buggerers, or sodomites. Rubus reports that the word sorcerer was in those days expressed by the term Valdenses. Now the lapse of time between Claudius, Archbishop of Turin, and Waldo does not at all hinder the continual succession of those churches and that religion, no more than those dark intervals which were in the church before and after the deluge, those intervals of the Egyptian bondage, the judges, the Babylonish captivity, and the like in after ages, did hinder or interrupt the continual succession of the Jewish religion, no more than the sun or moon do cease to be, when their light is eclipsed or withdrawn from the eye by the interposition of other bodies, no more than the rivers Po, the Rhine, or Guadiana in Spain do lose their continual current, because for some time they run underground, or among the rocks and appear not. So for the Church of God, though sometimes it has not been so visible to the eyes of men, it has, notwithstanding, continued in a constant, uninterrupted succession through all ages and generations. Thus the good prophet Eliah in his days thought he had been left alone, but yet God had reserved at that very time 7,000 souls of the very same principles and profession with himself. Although this be a truth that is by many thought sufficient of itself against the fiercest objections of the gainsaying adversaries, yet I shall proceed a step further, and make bold to allege moreover, that Mark Aurelio Rorenco, prior of Lucerna, in his narration del Introduzione degli Heretici nel Val de Piemont, printed at Turin, Anno Dom 1632, with approbation and privilege, confesses that it continued to the 9th and 10th century, which is the very interval between the said Claudius and Peter Waldo, or rather the retreat of certain of his disciples into the said valleys. For the said Rorenco testifies in express terms, page 16. The above said heresy continued throughout the 9th and 10th centuries. And to remove all scruples, that this doctrine which he calls heresy, as St. Paul speaks, Acts 24:14, and which the enemies of the Christian religion call heresy, continued in the valleys of Piemont. The same Rorenco, in his historical observations printed at Turin 1649, with approbation, and dedicated to the Duke himself, confesseth, page 3, that the said Claudius, Archbishop of Turin, and consequently of the valleys which were within that diocese, maintained this very doctrine in the 9th century. Wherefore, seeing the succession of the evangelical religion is manifest from the time of the apostles to that of Claudius, Archbishop of Turin, which was in the 8th century, and that his doctrine continued in the 9th and 10th centuries, and that in the beginning of the 11th century, the Waldenses or disciples of Peter Waldo came into the valley to reside with their brethren, where they have professed and taught the same ever since. The professors of the Reformed religion may clap their hands in token of an absolute triumph forever against all the disciples of the Church of Rome, and say that they are now able manifestly and undeniably to prove and make good the continual succession of their religion from the days of Christ and his apostles down to this present age. In the second place, the faithful people of the valleys in the year 1535, being at that time possessed of their ancient histories and manuscripts, testifying the antiquity of their churches, which were afterwards consumed to ashes by their persecutors in the years 1559 and 1560, caused to be printed at their own proper cost and charges the first French Bible that ever was put forth, or came to light, and that for the benefit of the evangelical churches, where this language was in use, and dedicated the same to God himself by the pen of their interpreter, Robert Olivetan, in the preface of the said Bible, which was a piece most solemnly consecrated, and speaking as it were to God himself, wherein they mention that they have always had the full enjoyment of that heavenly truth contained in the Holy Scriptures, ever since they were enriched with the same by the apostles themselves. And forasmuch as it is a piece so exceeding rare, and to be found in very few places of the world, I have here inserted the same at length, in the original language, and their own words, as followeth.